This episode is brought to you by the all-new 2024 Toyota Grand Highlander. Being the parent in charge of the neighborhood carpool can be intimidating, but with the 2024 Grand Highlander's more spacious third row, you can be confident of the space you're in. Confident enough to handle 5 kids, even if you don't understand when they say things like W-Riz. Learn more at exploresetoyota.com. Toyota, let's go places.
Come celebrate 10 years in the ultimate open world of Tamriel and play The Elder Scrolls Online for free, now until April 9th. Adventure solo or alongside friends on unforgettable quests slaying dragons, defending castles, and traversing wintry Skyrim or the mushroom forests of Morrowind. With no catch-up grind or subscription required and fun content no matter how long you have to play, start your legend today for free. Head to elderscrollsonline.com/freeplay, rated M for mature.
This is American History TV's Lectures in History podcast. Lectures in History joins students in the classroom to hear lectures on campuses across the country. This week, Longwood University President W. Taylor Reveley IV and political science professor Emeritus William Harbour teach a class about the presidencies of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush.
Okay, we are ready to begin. We have 2 classes left this semester, today and then after Thanksgiving. So I want to welcome C-SPAN and remind you in terms of what we've been doing this semester that thus far we've proceeded in a topical way on different aspects of the American presidency in the first half of each class, and then in the second half of each class we've had individual case studies. This class today and the next class will be different because we're focusing simply on case studies. So today we're going to talk about Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, and next time we'll talk about Barack Obama and Donald Trump. So, with that said, President Reveley usually makes some announcements at the beginning of our class.
Well, there'll be so little to talk about when we get to Donald Trump. I worry about the silence. With Bill Clinton and George W. on the docket today, there were a few things that warrant just some quick musing at the start. The first of which always takes some kind of older folks like us, Dr. Harbour and me, have to acclimate our psyches to realize that, to you all, Bill Clinton genuinely is a figure of history. You know, that none of you all have an active recollection or even a childhood recollection of Bill Clinton in office, which actually is kind of amazing always. And even W is kind of a hazy figure to you. None of you all were older than what, probably, was anybody older than 10 when W left office? No. So even W is kind of a childhood figure to you all. That just in and of itself gives a sense of, especially for us, how quickly history can move and how quickly things pass from current day to historical. And a dimension of that I've been thinking about too is, we're in the midst of this moment of kind of generational angst and change. Okay, boomer is pretty prevalent in the culture. Dr. Harbour, barely a boomer himself, but a proud boomer.
I remember Truman. Proud boomer.
The thing that's so striking to me about that is Bill Clinton, this person that now feels very historical. In 1992, the transition from Bush 41 to Bill Clinton was much kind of like this generational moment that we're in now with millennials and boomers. This moment when the baton really changed hands. Bill Clinton, kind of an archetypal boomer. Clinton and W born just a month apart in 1946. Archetypal boomer, 41, kind of archetypal member of the greatest generation. And at the time, it felt like this burst of energy and momentum and change Very self-consciously for Clinton, it was like a lot like 1960 when JFK takes office, first president born in the century after Eisenhower, 1960. In its own way, not unlike 1901 when Teddy Roosevelt, much younger than William McKinley, takes over, and there's this burst of energy, enthusiasm, momentum. And then the thing that's also difficult in the category of musings for you all to really capture in your minds is how different the world was in 1992. Cold War has ended, midst of a small recession, but not a grievous one, and there was this general atmospheric sense of optimism, almost easy optimism, in a way that's very hard for us to quite calibrate in our minds right now, just given the state of the world. And that prevailed all during Clinton's presidency, in part because of him and in part just because of things that were going on. Was certainly the climate that W inhabited when he was elected. That's why 9/11 was such a shock to the country, such a shock to him. He thought that he was going to be a domestic president that got to just focus on an era of kind of easy progress, and obviously that's changed so much. But that was what the world felt like in probably 1992 when Bill Clinton came along. So remarkable to think that for us this is a figure of history. Interesting to reflect on the generational change that was afoot right then. That we're at the tail end of right now. And, so strange to think about how different the world felt and how much more optimistic once upon a time.
Let's talk about Bill Clinton growing up. What we've tried to do for each president in each case study is to talk about their background a little bit. And we're always interested in finding out what you think about their growing up in terms of how it might have impacted their presidency in some way. So what stands out to you? Yes.
I think a thing that stands out for me for Clinton is his work ethic. Just like always having that dream of wanting to become president and working his way through school from Georgetown to going to Oxford in England, then going to Yale. I definitely see like him working influence like some of the legislation he tried to pass, like with healthcare and other stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah.
Another aspect that is worth mentioning is that he grew up to a middle-class family. Both of his parents were traveling salesmen. And in a time, like you just specified, President Reveley was, when he was growing up, it was, we were trying to like still segregate, there's still segregation, and we were kind of transpiring into an era where kind of uniting the country. And what I found is astonishing about his background is that both of his parents, despite everything, racial tensions in America, they would still sell to other ethnicity groups, African Americans in particular, just in that aspect. And also, he went to Catholic school as a young kid, so kind of allowed all this to transpire into his presidency.
Okay. May have gone to Catholic school, but perhaps did not absorb all the teachings, maybe. Anything else? Yes, Liam.
His stepfather was an abusive father to him.
Yeah, that's very important. Yeah. We've seen other presidents have difficult relationships with their father when we talked about Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, for instance. But for Clinton, what he saw in his home growing up, the kind of abuse, the kind of arguments and everything, that had to have some impact on him. His attempt as a young person to try to negotiate the differences between the adults in his life and everything, to try to handle that. I think if you read some of the literature about children who grew up in alcoholic homes, some of them develop a certain attitude about how to try to mediate conflicts.
Now to think historically too, a thing about growing up when born in 1946, like Clinton and W, is you grew up completely under the shadow of the modern presidency. The presidency is this august, incredibly powerful office, was just an ever-present reality in the life of Clinton and George Bush when they were growing up, which is different than prior presidents and prior.
Josue?
Also going off what you said about Harbour, in particular with negotiating, I mean, I can see how that kind of transpired because he was more of a centrist candidate. Throughout his entire whole presidency, he always tried to negotiate with Republicans. And in fact, he actually got the first president since 1969 to get a budget passed. And another aspect is John F. Kennedy was very influential in his life. He looked up to him. So that kind of also transpired to his presidency.
Okay. Anything else about Clinton's growing up in Arkansas? Yeah.
It was kind of, well, at least uncommon thing of now is a Democrat being raised in the South. But it kind of pushed him to find that more moderate sense and become the new Democrat.
Okay. What about his political career? Yeah.
I think he modernized the Democratic Party. He made it so it wasn't, because I think before it was a bit more business led, and I think he kind of modernized it so it was more for the middle class. He brought more middle class people into the Democratic Party. I know he was known in the party as the comeback kid, since he did change it a lot.
Okay.
And so in that vein, a thing certainly to think about, and it's a notable difference between George W. Bush and Clinton, but one of these phenomenons that we've talked about plenty over the course of the fall is Clinton, not born into affluence, really, born into poverty. W, born into tremendous wealth and privilege, and it's just a good reminder of the fact that those who have become president have come in all different, from all different types of backgrounds.
Your observations about his trying to change the Democratic Party, remember what you read about his leadership in the Democratic Leadership Council? Before his election, Republicans had won 5 of 6 presidential elections in a country where there were more Democrats than Republicans. And the Democratic Leadership Council tried to move the Democratic Party a little more to the center of the political spectrum. And he tried during parts of his presidency to do that.
Yeah, so, today, plenty of concern that the Democratic Party of 2019, 2020 has shifted too far to the left, that the Republican Party has shifted too far to the right. Similar during the late 70s and 80s as Bill Clinton was becoming politically active, that there was a concern that the party of McGovern, that had lost the 72 election in a landslide, had shifted too far to the left. And so Clinton, along with especially other Southern Democrats, worked hard to try to create structures and policy positions that shifted the party more towards the middle.
Yes.
And even today, in fact, with Mayor Bloomberg, he just announced his presidency, and he's kind of more in a centrist. So I kind of started to see there's kind of some shift going back to that center in the Democratic Party, because you're getting a lot of these concerns. Could an individual from the left, so far left, like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, could defeat President Trump? So you're kind of starting to see some of the balances. And I've seen over the debates that they're kind of pushing back to the left a little bit more to try to bring some more support and to rally against President Trump.
We talked about presidential elections in an earlier class period, and we pretty much covered the 92 election and the disadvantages that George Herbert Walker Bush had in terms of people being unhappy with his decision to abandon his promise not to raise taxes and the state of the economy, and Clinton having some real advantages in that election. Let's talk about Bill Clinton's first 2 years in office, though.
But a quick, just because it flashed my brain, interesting factoid about the 1992 election. Think regionally for a minute. Remember a three-way race, George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, Bill Clinton, Ross Perot. What part of the country were all three of them from? Yeah, they're all from the South. Think of how striking it would be if we had an election, in the next cycle or two, where everybody was from one part of the country, and especially from the South.
Let's talk about those tough first 2 years in office for Bill Clinton. Some of the achievements, some of the shortcomings, some of the politics coming out of that. Yes?
I think one thing was with foreign policy necessarily, with him having to deal with the massacre in Rwanda, and with like the United States and the UN not intervening soon enough. Also, the ethnic cleansing in
Rwanda.
Yeah.
Oh, Bosnia.
Yeah. And those countries too, which like showed like with foreign policy, he wasn't that great in the first years.
I think when you think about the Balkans, though, one of the legacies of the Clinton presidency is that even though he didn't have full congressional authorization, he eventually did take action in the Bosnian crisis and later in the Kosovo crisis. And in each case, by military and diplomatic intervention, put an end to ethnic cleansing. We have the Dayton Accords and everything in his first term. So there's some lasting legacies there for his administration. Yes?
I mean, you could say that he has some successes in foreign policy, especially in Northern Ireland.
Okay. The Good Friday Agreement, the Good Friday Accord, sending Mitchell there, that settlement existing to this day. And I think as you read in newspapers, part of the debate in the United Kingdom regarding Brexit is what to do about the borders there with Northern Ireland and everything. Even though there was all that burst of energy when Clinton was elected, a generational change, the politics of the era, I think, are marked by the pushback against him. For many people in the Republican Party, for many conservatives in the country, for older Americans, particularly for many Republicans who had had 5 or 6 presidential election victories, many people never saw the Clinton election or his presidency as legitimate. They talked about his evading the draft. They talked about marijuana use, things like that. For many people on the right, there was immediate contempt for Bill Clinton, particularly when you look at the rise of talk radio and personalities on talk radio who unrelentingly would go after both Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, leading to stories about people being killed mysteriously, people disappearing mysteriously. You had the very sad suicide of Vince Foster, a Clinton friend, in the first year of his presidency. Accusations on talk radio that somehow the Clintons were behind that. So politically, he inherited a great movement against him on talk radio.
We've talked at other points about this concept of the permanent campaign. The way that beginning in the 70s and really crescendoing more in the 80s, but then reaching kind of a point of perfection of the art in the 90s. Politics became ever present in the act of governing. It once upon a time was the case. We talk all the time about some things that are the same ever since America was founded, and some things that have changed with regards to the presidency. The permanent campaign would be a great example of something that is different, and had marked effect on the Clinton presidency, and he certainly in his administration participated in it very willfully. But the idea that once upon a time politics was about elections, and then an election would occur, and politics would obviously never completely stop, but there would be a genuine and bona fide effort to try to work across differences and build consensus a little bit outside of the hot glare of the political lights. And with the advent of different means of communication, quite literally cable TV, it became easier to continue to to mount the campaign even once an election was finished. And Clinton himself and his administration and his political apparatus perfected that art, but in the same moment, the Republicans were really perfecting the art as well. And so they never missed a moment to critique him or find wedge issues that could derail him from aspirations he may have politically and policy-wise. And similarly, the Clinton White House was working against the Republican Congress in the same way.
Let's talk about some early missteps in the first months of his presidency that really meant he had no honeymoon period. Do you remember reading about any of those problems early on? Some early decisions and appointment announcements that gave him a lot of bad press? Yes.
Particularly with, he repealed the ability for LGBTQ members to join the military. It kind of got a lot of pushback from Congress, and ended up happening was he tried to negotiate with Congress, and this is where you get the don't ask, don't tell policy. Okay. But that was kind of like a pushback from Congress telling him, like, hey, this is not the era at the time. And it's kind of reflecting back on like the politics of the era. Still kind of, you're still transitioning from a very conservative time to, more lenient to a liberal aspect of social issues.
Yeah, he didn't actually repeal their ability to serve. He made an announcement that would make it possible for them to officially serve, and there was great pushback from the military and key people in Congress. He was fulfilling a campaign promise, but he did that early on, which maybe in terms of what you know about attitudes today, seems like 1,000 years ago. Public opinion has changed so much on this social issue in this last decade and everything. But back in 1993, a very different set of attitudes existed. And by doing that so early, you get the pushback. And then his decision to adopt something called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was politically defeating both to the gay community that wanted an open opportunity to serve and to people opposed to them serving. So it turned out to be a disaster for him politically. But what about some appointments that created great embarrassment? And this goes back to the issue we talked about one day in terms of presidential transition periods, the importance of clearly vetting people and finding out about the individuals you're going to appoint. What happened in terms of appointments to the Attorney General's office? Which ironically ties into a controversial issue we have today regarding immigration. His first two appointments to be Attorney General, the individuals appointed had to withdraw when it turned out that they had employed as nannies individuals who were illegal immigrants.
And to connect a dot there, the permanent campaign and the appointment process, Republicans realized it was a chance to find kinks in the armor, so to speak, and embarrass the president early on. It's a similar thing that Democrats have done to Republicans as well. But in a different era, it may be that political appointees might not have gotten as much intense political scrutiny as really was happening in 93.
And in terms of the organization of the White House, I think you've read about how early on things were rather chaotic, that meetings would go on forever, schedules were constantly messed up. Early on, one Democratic member of Congress talking to another Democratic member of Congress said, if you're unhappy about an announcement from Bill Clinton today, don't worry about it. He might change his view tomorrow. So there was no strong chief of staff at that time, no discipline process. That comes later in his administration. And he got a lot of bad press from that.
And keep in mind the historical context there. Republicans have been relentlessly holding the White House, with just a couple exceptions, since the days of Richard Nixon. It was Republicans that really created the concept of the modern chief of staff. Jimmy Carter in '76 had famously, as you guys might remember, had pushed back on the idea of the need for a chief of staff and wanted to try to run things a little bit differently. Ultimately, that didn't work out so well for him, and he used more of a routine chief of staff model. But Bill Clinton is the first Democrat elected president, other than Jimmy Carter, all the way back to LBJ. And so the chief of staff model that Eisenhower had used so well, and then Reagan had really mastered, was just not quite in the DNA of the Democratic Party when it took the White House in 1992, and a sequence of embarrassment, some driven by disorganization, eventually prompted Clinton to change his mind and to start to really embrace the strong form chief of staff model, and that's what's endured all the way up to today for both parties since, Republicans and Democrats, though it's under pressure again with Donald Trump being interestingly wary of the strong chief of staff model.
Before we get to some of the political defeats of his first 2 years in office, let's talk about some early policy victories for Bill Clinton in those first 2 years. Yes?
You had NAFTA, the signing of NAFTA.
That's right. That's right.
From doing the readings, what I got was that, what's his name? Al Gore went on Larry King, and he debated Ross Perot. And the arguments that they were having was able to have persuasion on the American people to support them. It got more support from Republicans, of course, but Democrats eventually did support it. And kind of going back to that new Democrat idea that he had of, free markets, which ultimately kind of goes traditionally against what Democrats like Lyndon B. Johnson and so forth, and FDR, instituted in terms of trade.
Okay. The NAFTA victory was purchased with great Republican support and considerable Democratic opposition. It had been negotiated by George Herbert Walker Bush, and Clinton pursued it, and it was an early victory for his administration.
And like some things with Bill Clinton and his administration, at the time and the years quickly after, by and large, to most Americans seemed like a good thing, and it has subsequently, like free trade in general, begun to be viewed with a much more wary eye, by the country.
Any other early policy decisions that were successful? Yes.
Just going back to foreign policy, I think one aspect that that always admires me of American institutions of government is, when Saddam Hussein threatened to assassinate, there was a plot to assassinate President Bush. He was not reluctant to act on it, and he, assembled airstrike on intelligence facilities in Iraq. So I thought, just kind of like, while there is politics that divides the two, there's kind of like this absence that we're still one team, one fight. So.
Yeah, and that incident actually is, one of a series of things that ultimately brought George Bush Sr., Bush 41, and Bill Clinton to the point of being genuinely good friends. These two people who were hot political adversaries, losing a presidential election is pretty tough for the soul. Wound up being genuine friends later in life, and yeah, it is a remarkable thing.
And with great Democratic support, he managed to get through Congress something that Congress had passed and George Herbert Walker Bush had vetoed, and that was the Family Leave Act. The United States, being the only wealthy, industrial, democratic country in the world, does not provide an extensive program for family members who have children to have leave and get paid. The act did not require that people who took this leave get paid, but at least it gave them leave, at least if you worked in an area where there was a certain number of employees and everything. So that was a reward to a long-time Democratic platform position. Anything else? Yes?
The Brady Act?
Explain.
I'm not too sure on the depth on it, but I know it was a gun control reform.
You have, in the Clinton administration, a ban on assault weapons. And things continue to get debated on that area because eventually that ban was not renewed. One other thing, deficit reduction. Remember, Clinton had campaigned on a big middle-class tax cut, but the economy was already out of the recession. The Federal Reserve was more concerned about the deficit. Clinton put to Congress a controversial proposal to raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans and to cut spending in some areas. That passed on a purely partisan vote. Dick Cheney in the, not Dick Cheney, Al Gore in the Senate had to break the tie vote. And that act, of course, infuriated Republicans because it involved increasing taxes, but it's important to his presidency later on because it helped reduce the deficit that he had already inherited.
To put things in some macro historical perspective, when we talked about Eisenhower, you probably remember that one of the things that was especially relevant about Eisenhower was he came in the wake of all of FDR's reforms and social programs, and the Republican Party at that point was very tempted to just actively oppose things like Social Security and the expansion of the federal government in general. And Eisenhower, a Republican, and his administration chose to essentially embrace the innovations that the FDR administration had made and acquiesce and even enthusiastically acknowledge that America now had a large federal government, and the fact that an opposition party had embraced that the Republicans had embraced that democratic idea went a long way to essentially locking in the idea for generations to come that the federal government was going to be a large operation engaged in lots of social endeavors as well as more classic national security endeavors. Similarly, Bill Clinton comes in the wake of the Reagan Revolution, the effort to significantly reduce taxes, the effort to at least control the growth of the federal government, especially with regards to social programs. And Bill Clinton, the first Democrat to be in office, since that Reagan Revolution, similarly, like with Eisenhower, essentially embraced the Reagan Revolution. A Democrat, rather than taking office and immediately trying to swell the federal government, instantaneously raise taxes very dramatically, took a more middle path, and that, interestingly enough, has, like with Eisenhower's embrace of FDR policies or the policy framework, Clinton's embrace of the Reagan policy framework has essentially been the default setting for America subsequently.
Except for one big exception involving his greatest political defeat in the first 2 years, health care. He hoped to be the president who would provide the United States with a comprehensive universal system of health care coverage to join much of the rest of the world. He appointed his wife, Hillary Clinton, to lead that effort, and it leads to total defeat. Why was it defeated? How was it defeated? What went wrong? Because for Bill Clinton, I think for him, that in his mind would have been the crowning achievement as president, to be able to do that, to succeed where other presidents had failed. What politically went wrong? Yes.
Well, going into it, his staff advised him not to because he campaigned for national service and welfare reform, not health care. So they warned him he was going to have a tough battle going into it.
Okay. Yeah.
The 1994 election also took a toll on that.
Absolutely.
Where he had to compromise with both Republicans and Democrats, because there were some Democrats that even were not on his side.
This failed effort allowed Republicans to paint him as a typical Democrat, not a new Democrat. And think of the politics of it. A large commission that met under conditions of secrecy, so that even Democrats in Congress were, in many cases, cut out of the loop, and they have their own ideas. Instead, this commission, headed by his wife, develops an extremely complicated plan, 1,300 pages long, that involved a combination of some marketplace forces, all kinds of government regulations, managed competition, a plan few people could understand, and immediate, fierce opposition to it. Even though at first public opinion was sympathetic, the ads, organized by a coalition of insurance industry people, the Harriet and Louise ads, helped to erode support for that. And eventually, it's defeated.
And in this category of the permanent campaign, these were ads by Republican forces appealing to the American people. So it was not just kind of a conflict within the halls of Congress that ultimately defeated Bill and Hillary Clinton's health care reform aspirations. It was the permanent campaign being waged kind of across the country and over the airwaves that eroded the support too.
The commission seemed to exclude major stakeholders in the healthcare industry, a major part of the American economy. Feeling excluded, they struck back. No, when we get to the Obama presidency next week and we talk about the passing of the Affordable Care Act, his efforts early on to enlist support from people in the healthcare professions and everything. The '94 election, a bloodbath. For the first time in 40 years, Republicans would get control of both houses of Congress.
Yeah, and to get your brain ready to contemplate '94, think about '92 again. A president who's 46 years old and a new generation. Democrats in control. Who's a Democrat? Democrats in control of both houses of Congress. It feels like a new day, certainly for those strongly sympathetic to what was going on, that a new day was coming, and that all sorts of great changes were going to be ushered in. However, Bill Clinton, for all his appetite for the White House throughout his adolescence and early adulthood, for all of his political experience in Arkansas, he did not, and nationwide in the Democratic Party, he did not actually have any Washington experience when he showed up at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And that is what really came to bite him in those first 2 years. Was he was not able to nimbly navigate with a Democratic Congress. Democratic president was not able to nimbly navigate with a Democratic Congress.
After that '94 election, all kinds of experts and people writing newspaper articles were talking about Bill Clinton would be a one-term president. He was through. That the Republicans now ran Congress. Newt Gingrich, the new Speaker of the House, would be a kind of prime minister, and that Clinton was now going to be irrelevant. How does Bill Clinton navigate that situation to make a comeback? Or how maybe do Republicans make some tactical errors that help him to make that comeback? He's going to get reelected in '96. What makes that possible? What goes on there?
So there's one very sad event that during which Bill Clinton performs very admirably that begins to change sensibilities.
Well, one aspect that,
Yeah.
before I answer the question that I said, is that Hillary Clinton, in fact, called, is it Dick Morris? What's his name? Campaign manager.
Dick Morris.
Yes. And he comes down and he's like, okay, well, we're going to do this. And he's Republican centrist individual as well. He tells them that you're going to have to run the government in a centrist aspect. They called it the third way. They kind of advertised that.
Another term, triangulation. Triangulation. Morris and Clinton hit upon a very clever strategy. The president would tactfully separate himself from some aspects of the Democratic agenda, but still oppose aspects of the Republican agenda. He would play the two sides off against each other, and in a sense, he had Republican help. Having achieved control of Congress, they pressed aspects of their contract with America. They started to develop budgets with big cuts to Medicare, to cut back on education and environmental programs. Clinton resisted. He would veto those budgets, and in the fall and winter of 95, 96, you had government close downs. Now, think constitutionally for a moment. If the government closes down because there's no budget, you could say both the president, who's vetoed the budget, and the Congress are responsible. But public opinion counts for a lot in terms of how people perceive this. Overwhelmingly, Clinton won the public relations battle. Clinton emphasized, hey, I'm trying to balance the budget, but I don't want to cut education, I don't want to cut Medicare, I don't want to cut the environment, I want to help children and old people. The Republicans took a beating in public opinion. Also at the time, that fierce talk radio assault on Bill and Hillary Clinton began to rub much of the public the wrong way. So suddenly, he's standing up to people who want to cut popular programs. This is the way to come back, along with the economy taking off.
And so political winds are changing. Economy is beginning to boom. We have the the early manifestations of the internet age beginning, around 94, 95, which to you all seems like Neolithic history, the concept of a world without the internet. Something that I think future historians really closely looking through the Clinton presidency will pay attention to as well is something that happened in the spring of 95. The Oklahoma City bombing, an act of domestic terrorism in which countless lives were lost in a horrific bombing. Before that happened, Bill Clinton had struggled with some of they could be called the atmospherics of the office. Had trouble with the broad American public thinking of him in the presidential terms that they say that people conceptualize, say Ronald Reagan. In the face of a horrible tragedy, he was that source of solace, that soothing presence that the country craved at that moment, and that, as much as anything, could be the pinpoint spot to really identify as when the Bill Clinton who left office with a approval rating above 60% began to emerge was there in that spring of 95 in Oklahoma City.
Yes.
So an aspect, so Bill Clinton was fighting back through vetoing, and he won the public opinion. So in some essence, did Republicans kind of fail on their promises with the contract of America to America because they kind of failed to reduce government size and stuff, overall bring down taxes and so forth? So did they fail the public?
From their point of view, the contract said that they would propose and pass in Congress certain proposals. A lot of those proposals were vetoed by President Clinton. They also made some internal changes in the rules in Congress in terms of how the committees worked and seniority and how long you would serve as chair and things like that. So they did fulfill many parts of their contract. Down the road, though, particularly by the end of the presidency of George W. Bush, when you get early into the Obama era, you have the emergence of the Tea Party, where the Tea Party people are going to go back and critique the Republican Party itself, particularly the party of George W. Bush, in terms of some of his programs and everything. So out there in the public, there would be the sense for the Tea Party people, the Republican Party did not deliver.
If there's a thing about American politics that history often teaches, it's how quickly sentiments can change. So Bill Clinton elected in '92 with momentum that felt historic, then humbled in '94 with a rebuke that felt historic, and then re-elected in '96 in what of recent elections probably counts as one that was just never really close. Runs against Bob Dole, who had been a longtime senator, vice presidential running mate to Gerald Ford in '76. But the '96 election, which in 1994 you might have thought, well, this is when Bill Clinton is going to get his comeuppance, and he never achieved liftoff, and Republicans have seized control of Congress. There's no way he's going to win in '96, and '96, remarkably, in part because the economy is booming, in part because Bill Clinton and Dick Morris strike upon the triangulation approach, in part because he achieved presidential gravitas in the wake of Oklahoma City. '96 is a cakewalk as presidential elections go. However, to his great chagrin, he didn't cross the 50% threshold on the popular vote in '96 either, even though the election was so relatively easy and straightforward for him. Ross Perot fitfully ran again in '96 without quite the enthusiasm or the oomph of '92, but that was enough to keep Clinton from getting more than 49% of the vote.
After his re-election in '96, in 1997, he strikes a deal with the Republicans in Congress. A budget act that will reduce the deficit even more in the future, the Balanced Budget Act. That, along with the incredibly booming economy of the 90s, will lead eventually to a balanced budget, which has long since disappeared as far as federal fiscal policy is concerned.
A rarity, a unicorn, the balanced budget.
In '97, things look great for Clinton, don't they? He's won that re-election, he has that economy going for him, he has that deal on balancing the budget. But then when you get into '98, there's what we talked about last time in class when we covered major presidential scandals, right? The Lewinsky scandal, the eventual impeachment of the president, everything like that. We don't want to cover all that material again, but politically speaking, what are your conclusions about that whole episode in terms of political lessons? Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Ben. Ben Bree.
If you're going to get into a scandal, just admit it and be upfront with it right away. Don't try and cover it up, because it's usually the cover-up that gets you in trouble. Or more trouble than would be interesting.
The famous line about the affair, something that is going to always tarnish him along with the impeachment. His legacy is never going to be able to escape what happened in that respect. Bree.
Just the use of executive privilege and how that is portrayed to the American people too, in terms of character and again honesty.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, in the political aspect, it kind of backfired on Republicans with all the congressional hearings and the impeachment trials and so forth, because the '98 election came and Republicans lost, and so it kind of pushed back on Republicans because he was so popular with the American people.
Yeah, going into the '98 off-year election, the assumption would be that the Republicans would pick up seats in the House of Representatives, but actually they lost seats in the House of Representatives. There's a lesson here that's similar to the lesson of '95-'96 in terms of that budget showdown. Overreaching in politics. Republicans understood the public was against impeachment overwhelmingly. When they finally vote for impeachment, Clinton is at the high point of his popularity. There aren't the votes in the Senate to remove him from office. Overreaching. And he survives, with lasting implications, though, for his legacy in terms of matters of personal integrity and everything. Anything else about the last 2 years in office or his legacy in general before we move on and talk about George W. Bush? Postway?
Question. So, with Congress and him repealing the Glass-Steagall, would that kind of transpire some of the events that we had in 2008 with the economy crashing?
There's certainly whether the Clinton era repeal of various banking statutes and banking regulations contributed meaningfully to 2008 is a question that plenty of people feel very strongly about. That they unquestionably did. Bill Clinton and others would say that they were relatively unrelated, but it was an era in which Clinton, rather than somewhat like we were talking about a few minutes ago, somewhat embracing the Reagan Revolution, rather than tightening regulation kind of across the board, saw fit to loosen regulation in somewhat a Reagan-esque fashion in any number of sectors, and so that's one potentially deep legacy of the Clinton years that people will debate for years to come. Relationship with Russia is not something that and the former Soviet Union is not something we've talked about a great deal, but the dominating issue in foreign policy and global politics for 2 generations was the Cold War, which by '92 and Clinton's election had largely, and even its long tentacles kind of drawn to a full close. And people debate now whether Clinton could have, in his White House, done more to help Russia onto a strong road of democracy and reform, or whether what's transpired in Russia since was just an inevitable phenomenon. But that's certainly one aspect of Clinton's 8 years in office, that Russia, step by step, kind of drifted towards where it is now, rather than turning into something else. And a big thing is, and here Andrew Jackson in a way is maybe a parallel, but so much of Bill Clinton's personal conduct while he was in office felt debatable, and people who probably would not debate it today felt like it was a very debatable thing, and people took partisan sides. Whereas in the longer lens of history, it seems less like something that anybody would strongly defend, in somewhat the same way that with Andrew Jackson in his day, his policy towards Native Americans felt debatable, and in retrospect feels very much not debatable.
Certainly for anyone who is president of a major corporation these days, or president of a university, if you are in that powerful position and have even consensual sex with a younger intern, you're going to get fired or you're going to resign in disgrace. Clinton got through that. He had the economy and maybe some different attitudes than what exists today. Yes?
Clinton's legacy were always quick to bring up the fact of his extramarital affairs, but he seems like the only president people really bring it up about when there's plenty of evidence on the other presidents, especially like FDR.
Or John
Kennedy.
Yeah. A lot of digging back to other presidents. We do have a time issue here, so we need to talk about George W. Bush, who certainly grows up in a very different environment than Bill Clinton, right?
So again,
grows up in fantastic circumstances.
Born 1 month apart, but almost in, well, not even almost, in profoundly different circumstances.
Born into luxury, a famous American family, going to the top institutions without having to worry about getting scholarships or working his way through the system of higher education in terms of working while you're also trying to study, something I know many students face today in a very difficult way. What stands out about his growing up, though, that you think is important to understanding his presidency? Anything? Yes.
I would say, growing up, I would say most of like his military service, the Air Force, correct?
National Guard.
National Guard. Yeah.
National
Sorry.
Guard. Which would always be a source of controversy because he served in the Texas National Guard. He did not go to Vietnam, and that would surface in both of his campaigns. Anything else about his growing up? Yeah.
Just him looking at his father as a role model definitely probably pushed him into wanting to run for president and taking office in other branches of the government.
Yeah. A legacy there, a set of experiences, an example, a role model, but also some difficult issues growing up. We know about his first 3 decades that he wasn't exactly in his personal life what his father might have expected.
Yeah, so one more contrast with Clinton that's interesting is they're born into different circumstances. Clinton, born into much more difficult circumstances, is the shining star, in his school days and in his early professional years, whereas George W. is kind of wayward, might be a way to put it, deep into adult life.
Certainly, if you read what Bush himself has said about his life, he would make the observation, if he were here in class today, that in his 1940s, when he embraced his evangelical Christian faith, that was a turning point in his life. It's important to his presidency when you think about his emphasis in domestic policy on faith-based initiatives in terms of making it easier for private sector faith-based organizations to receive federal funds to do community service work, to deal with addiction and things like that. That's important to his life story and his presidency. Anything else? Anything else about his growing up? Okay. Yes.
I'll never forget this, but I was watching the speech that he gave, and it was on the news, and he said that he went to Harvard, and he said that it's okay if you guys have A's, but it's also okay if you have C students. And he was a C student at Harvard, which I thought was pretty funny.
Okay. Liam?
He was also a member of that secret society at Harvard, the Skull and Bones
The Skull and Bones, that's right. George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, John Kerry, all members of that special secret society. I think what's interesting about Bush's image in the public, though, was here's a person from such an elite background, such opportunity, who, basically growing up in Texas, develops a kind of style that makes him able to relate to people that you would normally think individuals born to that class would not be able to do that and everything. And that's part of his background. What we know, of course, he makes an early run for Congress. He loses that first election. He's going to work on his father's campaigns, things like that. He's going to go into business. He's going to be partial owner of the Texas Rangers and everything like that. But when you think about Texas politics, he pulls off a stunning upset to start his victories in Texas and then to the White House.
Well, and to put that stunning upset in context, but for Bill Clinton defeating George Bush the Elder in 1992, almost certainly the case that George W. would not have had a clear pathway to high-level elected politics, that it would have been just difficult and unusual for the son of a sitting president to run for governor of Texas in '94. If not for Bill Clinton winning in '92, George W. might not have become the figure we know.
One political lesson we talked about early in the semester was the danger of a political party underestimating a challenger. We saw that with the Democrats, with Ronald Reagan when he first ran for governor in California. We see that with George W. Bush when he takes on Ann Richards in Texas. Ann Richards, a popular governor, a charismatic governor, a person who had certainly irritated the Bush family when in a convention speech she made fun of George W. Bush's father by saying that he was born with a silver foot in his mouth. People do not think George W. Bush can win, but he wins. He does his homework. He focuses on certain issues in terms of education reform, welfare reform. He pulls the upset and then gets reelected in a landslide. They underestimated him. I think Bill Clinton would later observe during Bush's first term in office and his talking to other Democrats that Democrats underestimated George W. Bush at their risk and everything. But why is it that he's able to get the nomination? After all, there's somebody like John McCain who would like to be president. McCain is going to try to get that nomination in 2000. McCain has all this experience. What does Bush have going for him, besides the family name? Yeah.
Last name, like he was familiar. I think it was like nice for like the American people to be like, oh, like we kind of know like what he like stands for without even like needing to like listen to the news or watch something, because I think a lot of people like compared him to his father, and I think that familiarity was really like a good platform for him to like work off of and build from.
Okay, please.
His personality, he was more laid back. He seemed like a guy you would enjoy hanging out with, while Al Gore kind of seemed like someone you'd rather pull teeth than hang out with.
Yeah.
He kind of also had a centrist approach to politics. He was trying to say it was a conservatism. What was the word?
Compassionate
conservatism. So, he's kind of able to pull other people that, somebody like McCain would not be able to grasp.
Not only the name, but when a party is out of power for a couple of terms, they really want to get the White House back. And George W. Bush was perceived as more moderate than some other possible Republican candidates. And at that time, Republicans controlled most of the governorships in the state, in the big states except for California. Those governors early on endorsed him. Plus, Bush had worked hard to cultivate the support of key conservatives in the Republican Party in Congress. So he had the weight of the establishment behind him.
And an object lesson of what money in politics can do, and then a subsequent lesson in what money in politics can't do. In the 2000 race, George W. was the Republican that could raise, at the time, astronomical figures in the primary. And that had the effect of kind of in the political term of art, kind of clearing the field. Other candidates couldn't quite, they didn't feel like they could compete with that kind of fundraising. And so other candidates that might have been strong, at least on paper, also chose not to jump in as robustly as they might otherwise have because of that fundraising prowess. Now, fast forward 16 years, George W.'s brother, Jeb, thought that playbook was going to work again. And so, those of you who paid close attention to the 16 Republican primary know that Jeb raised a gargantuan amount of money on the front end of the primary, and yet that didn't work in 16. And it is fascinating the way money sometimes really does the trick, and sometimes it really doesn't.
Yes. Yeah. Emily?
When we were kind of talking about that, I actually see more of a comparison to Hillary Clinton as opposed to Jeb Bush, because I think there were so many people that did jump into the Republican field that Jeb Bush's name just kind of got lost, and especially with the attacks that Donald Trump made on him and really getting all that news attention. I think the money at that point in time just didn't really help him. But then I think if you look at Hillary Clinton in the Democratic field, you really see people like Elizabeth Warren, who didn't jump in and has now come through this election and has been one of the most like one of the larger names out there and like one of the front runners that we're hearing about the most. And a lot of people were talking about why she wasn't running in 2016, and I think it was because Hillary Clinton jumped in, and so many of like Democratic donors, like they knew the Clinton name. Not necessarily everybody liked the Clinton name, but it was a name that you knew. It was like a household name, and it was easy to get behind.
And in an alternate universe, legions of students are very confused about the progression of U.S. presidents. Because in an alternate universe, it goes Bush, Clinton, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and gets pretty wonky there.
We'll not get into string theory of multiple universes today. Yes, Jose.
Kind of just reflecting back on like the Texas, how he pressed everyone, how he pulled out an astonishing victory. In the 2000 election, you had the Political Science Association that pulled out 7 scholars that said they predicted that Bush would lose the election by like a huge margin, but the end results went completely against what they said.
So, 2 buckets of interesting factoid with the 2000 election. The first of which is, and we talked about this, right at the start of the fall. But a quirk of American history that may well have played out to our advantage is so many of the early presidents did not have male children. So. Washington did not, Adams did, which becomes relevant, but Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, none of them had male children. If the early presidents had male children, we could have, speaking of alternate universes, easily had some situation in which it became expected, as happened. So the first president with a male child, John Adams, one of his sons was elected president. If that had been the normal pattern early on, it could have quickly pushed American politics into a very different realm. A lot more like a more classic aristocracy. It's obviously very unusual for George W. to be elected after his father has also been president, and John Adams and John Quincy Adams, the only other time that's happened. The other bucket of interesting factoid to me is there are now, if you put the 1876 election to the side, which was contested and complicated for other reasons related to kind of the tail end of Reconstruction. There are 4 times when there's been a difference between the popular vote and the electoral college vote, and the electoral college vote, has carried the day. 1824, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. 1888 with Grover Cleveland losing to Benjamin Harrison. There'll be a common thread to all these. 2000 with Gore losing to Bush, and now 2016 with Trump beating Hillary. So before 2016, all 3 of those instances had weirdly, I don't have any theory here, it's just an interesting coincidence, weirdly involved legacy presidents. John Quincy Adams wins in a contested one. Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison of Hampton Sydney, ignominy, and then George W. beating Gore, and that's just a fascinating thing. That probably in some way that would be hard to completely stitch together, just underscores the fact that a legacy candidate has a really strong network to draw on that can help win an election in a really close run thing. Then of course we get to 16, and that breaks the pattern I was just talking about. But it's fascinating that a legacy candidate is still involved, even if on the losing side of the election.
Josue, your comment about the predictions of that election, I think we should think about for a moment. Those predictions that Gore would easily win were based upon running statistics about the state of the economy in that election compared to other elections. And when they ran the models, Gore should win. Well, he did win the popular vote, though, right? But he didn't win by millions. He only won the popular vote by 500,000 for Gore. And then you had, of course, Florida. Now, we talked about the 2000 election in an earlier class, so we'll not cover much of that today. But bear in mind the controversies about that recount in Florida. Bear in mind the disaster for Al Gore that Ralph Nader was on the ballot and picked up 97,000 votes in Florida, most of which would probably have gone to Gore if Nader had not been there siphoning off votes. The Supreme Court decision remains controversial to this day, and it represents a general problem for the judiciary in terms of the controversies we've talked about in another class period, the judiciary becoming less respected, more controversial, being perceived as more political and everything. And as you follow current news, I think we have to wait for a few months because there are a couple of big decisions out there regarding people testifying from the White House regarding President Trump's taxes. We're going to have to look and see how the judiciary handles that and what happens in terms of public response and everything.
But the a thing about 2000, which we've talked about in the past a little bit too, like with 96, the election did not feel to America like it was very high stakes. It felt, in 96, it felt like a relatively not high stakes choice, easy choice of Clinton to the American people. And in 2000, it felt like George W. and Gore were not all that far apart on policy matters. And if you look at the voter participation numbers in 96 and 2000, you see that they've dropped off as compared to a bit of a strong uptick in 92. Where 92 actually has the highest voter participation levels since the 1960s. But 96, 2000, they're kind of in a much softer zone, but they spike back up again in 04 and have been kind of rising since.
Let's talk about George W. Bush's presidency then. Clearly, there's the cloud that hangs over him in terms of not winning the popular vote, but he's determined to push forward with his agenda, and his agenda is a mixture of compassionate conservatism and some old-time basic Republican themes about cutting taxes. So in that first year of office, he does get a major tax cut through. That will become controversial later on with deficits and everything else. But what are some of the other policies he's pursuing early on? We'll get to 9/11 in a little while. Elise?
No child left behind.
No child left behind. Remember, as governor of Texas, he had positioned himself as a compassionate conservative, interested in education reform. Here was an opportunity to repeat in Washington what he had done in Texas, working with Democrats. And he works with Senator Kennedy and others that get No Child Left Behind, which at the time had a large amount of bipartisan support. But we talked about the roller coaster of public opinion in American politics. Moving into the future, that reform that was once basically popular has both people on the left and the right turning against it. Too much testing, too much money, et cetera, too much federal regulations. Teachers resisting it, Republicans resisting it, and everything. But at the time, it was an important victory that fulfilled a campaign pledge. And of course, you have his efforts to try to make it easier for faith-based organizations to receive more federal funds. But there's also some political setbacks going on early on. Control of the Senate. In that first year, a few months into his presidency, a Republican senator decides to no longer sit with the Republican caucus, and he sits with the Democratic group. that changes control of the Senate. Chairmanship of all the committees will be altered and everything. Then, of course, 9/11, which we talked a bit about in another class when we talked about foreign policy. And Bush's presidency has transformed, right? Think about Bush before 9/11. About 51% job approval rating. Focus on domestic policy, and then everything changes. And the shock the nation faces, and the rally around the flag, rally around the commander-in-chief. All of a sudden, he becomes the most popular president in public opinion polls up into the 90s for a while. A new adventure for his White House. Observations about the foreign policies that spring from that. Yes?
I was just going to say, about 9/11, I think one of the most impactful moves that he made was going back to the White House that night rather than staying in a bunker. I think he really led the American people with the belief that we're not going to live in fear. Their intent was to scare us, and we're not scared. That's what he was I'm not staying in a bunker. I'm going back to the White House because all the other people are not in bunkers. So why should I be in one too?
We've talked about the rhetorical presidency in another class, but his address on television that night of 9/11, his going to New York City and standing on the rubble, talking to the firemen, explaining the people who did that would be hearing from all of us, his address to Congress, those were all very well received public addresses in terms of public opinion. Yes?
I think one of the most beautiful things that came out of that tragedy was that Bush had the ability to make Americans not think about Republicans or Democrats. We put that aside and we came together as just Americans to go against this war on terrorism. So,
yeah, not thinking like Democrats and Republicans coming together, maybe like in string theory, and it seems now to be an alternative universe, doesn't it? But for a brief moment, yes.
The two aspects that really came out of that as well is an expansion of the president's powers.
Oh, yes.
And another thing that actually it was in the syllabus and it was in the last exam, but it was the video on Cheney's law. Yeah, Cheney's law, and basically the amount of power that the vice presidency, or influence in better aspects, was able to have on Bush in terms of foreign policy when it came to terrorism and how do you manage enemy combatants and Guantanamo Bay and so forth. It just kind of opened up an idea of a unitarian presidency.
Yeah, and to draw a parallel with Clinton that we were talking about a minute ago, it's 9/11 that really imbues George W. In the eyes of Americans, in the eyes of people across the country, with the qualities of a president. That he really seems presidential, much like with Bill Clinton in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, something that he had struggled with before, suddenly kind of snapped into focus. That the American people really thought of Bill Clinton from that point forward as the president, and 9/11 forward is really the moment when that happens with W too.
And did ordinary people think in that moment that the person that they had rallied behind would leave office with only about a 33% or so popularity rating, leaving office extremely unpopular? The roller coaster ride that many presidents seem to experience during their time in office. Let's talk a little bit about the expansion of presidential power. And we had a class early on where we talked about the unitary executive theory that had developed currency that was fully articulated by Dick Cheney and others. Those early decisions, Congress gives Bush a blank check in authorizing the use of force against anyone who was associated with those attacks or anyone who might attack us. Bush is going to take that as justification for later actions that are going to become much more controversial. The fateful decision urged upon him by many of his advisors to link Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Afghanistan to Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Early on in cabinet meetings, right after the 9/11 attack, Bush had rejected that. But by the time you get to 2002, suddenly Bush is leaning in the direction that we are going to deal with Saddam Hussein. And you have a year and a half discussion about whether to go after Saddam Hussein, invade Iraq, and Bush signs off on that, with all the debates about so-called links to terrorism and, of course, weapons of mass destruction. And we talked in another class about how that story turned out. And with the invasion of Iraq, you have occupation, right? Go back and read newspaper stories about what administrative officials were saying at the time of the invasion. This will be a fast war. It'll be over in months or weeks. The Iraqis will put together a new government, and for some of the more optimistic people supporting this, Iraq would become a thriving democracy, a Western ally, and by bringing democracy to Iraq, the whole Middle East would be transformed. Well, it did get transformed in some ways, but it didn't go well, right? We still have people in Iraq. The cost to human lives, American lives, Iraqi lives, the disruption of balance of power by different players in the Middle East, all working to the advantage of the Iranians and everything. What else should we add about that fateful decision, though, in terms of for George W. Bush, the country is still behind him to get reelected in 2004, this time winning a majority of the vote. He wins by 3 million votes. He defeats John Kerry. He had the successful midterm election in 2002 where Republicans had picked up seats, a big thing in terms of normal midterm elections. But beginning in 2005, 2006, what is going wrong besides the fact that the war in Iraq seems to be going on? There's this insurgency, all the violence, everything like that. Yes?
The economy was failing.
Well, the economy is slowing down, but it's going to be December 2007 when technically the recession begins and you have the financial collapse in the fall later in the fall, okay, in 2008. So what else is going wrong for George Bush? Yeah.
There's so many legal cases being presented to the court.
Okay, there are setbacks in terms of court decisions. I guess we need to talk about the whole issue of civil liberties. We talked about, of course, the war in Iraq. We've seen throughout this course in looking at the American presidency that in times of international crises or war, not only does a lot of power go to the president, but something tends to happen in terms of civil liberties. Remember John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts? Remember Woodrow Wilson and the laws passed by Congress there and the people who went to jail and everything? Franklin Roosevelt, the internment of Japanese Americans. When it comes to what happens after 9/11, you have Bush's decision to treat people captured on the battlefield differently than according to the Geneva Convention. You have the controversial decisions about enhanced interrogation, torture. You have secret surveillance of Americans conducted by the government. All kinds of things are going on there, plus some Supreme Court decisions telling the Bush administration that your military tribunals are unconstitutional. Now, Congress is going to go back and legislate in such a way that is going to allow Bush to do some of the things he had been doing, but increase controversy. And what often happens in American history is years after the panic and the reaction, the shock of conflict and war, people begin to recover from they have a hangover or they recover from it. They think to themselves, should we have done those things? Think of how we now think about internment of Japanese Americans. Think of how we now think about enhanced interrogation, waterboarding.
In similar vein, playing forward from 9/11, the Bush administration would contend that they had a defensible cause of action to a rationale that was strong to begin the Iraq War. In retrospect, it seems much more faulty, that the rationale was not strong, but they really do feel that in the run up to it was the sensible, even the hard but brave course of action that had to be pursued. And it is this endlessly fascinating quirk of history that things in historical perspective can look very different than they do in the lived moment leading up to it. So the national security considerations around civil liberties, in the wake of 9/11, felt in that hot moment, I'd say even to most people, like they were quite sensible. But in retrospect, they look very different, and that's the constant pivot that an administration in office has to actually be contemplating too.
Yeah, if you put yourself in the shoes of the people in the White House at that time, they believed, and so many experts went on TV and said, this is only the beginning of more attacks. I think if you went back and looked at recordings of television news programs at the time and talk shows, there would be experts on saying that, sooner or later a terrorist organization is going to get their hands on a nuclear bomb, and they're going to put it in a container, and it's going to show up in an American port, and we're going to lose an American city. And the Bush administration basically believed they would do anything to prevent that happening. Bear in mind, something you might not read about too often, right after 9/11, you had the anthrax attacks. So the whole thing about terrorism, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, it all gets tied together. And for George Bush and Dick Cheney, 9/11 had happened on their watch. Was it going to happen again? And they went in a certain direction that had all kinds of consequences that we're living with today, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria.
And like with Bill Clinton and Bill Clinton's legacy, it's open to speculation how deeper history will reflect on the Bush years. On the one hand, you have at least two things that would have been very hard to have stopped beforehand: 9/11 and Katrina. But both these disasters at an epic scale that it's difficult to perhaps hold somebody responsible for. At least the fact that they happened. The aftermath is a different thing. Then you've got the 2008 crash. More debatable as to whether that was something that could have been stopped, to what extent that was something that the Bush administration had given rise to, that it had deeper roots. But just right there, you've got three of if you were drawing up a list of the 20 worst things that have domestically happened to America over time, you've got three contenders for that top 20 list: 9/11, Katrina, and the Great Recession in 2008. That's a lot for an administration to grapple with. You layer the Iraq War on top of that, and with it being as debatable as it is as to whether that was wise. But that is a lot that the administration, the Bush administration, was saying grace over. And you know what history will think is a little bit hard to say. You know, in the way that Harry Truman, as we've talked about, you know, left office tail between his legs with incredibly low approval ratings, and nobody thought that subsequent years would look at him favorably, and yet Harry Truman is now thought of as one of the greats. You know, it would probably surprise everybody if George W. somehow you know, got exalted into the far upper reaches, but whether you know, in you all's lifetimes and in the decades ahead, the Bush years will be seen the way so much of the country saw them at the very end, I think is a different question. And the Clinton years offer that strong contrast. They when they were concluding, seemed like they were going to be looked at as this halcyon era, you know, of you know, success after success, you know, with a lot of political noise around it, and that's not, at least in the present moment, the way history is inclining to think about them now.
Well, I do have some Democratic friends who on social media often say, in terms of Donald Trump, that they now miss George Bush. So I don't know if that means that there's going to be complete rehabilitation of his legacy or not. But Katrina, a natural disaster. And indeed, if you want to defend Bush on this, the mistakes and misjudgments and problems at the local level and state level were pretty darn substantial. But remember we talked about the public presidency, the permanent campaign, trying to present the best possible image in photo ops for presidents. The picture of George W. Bush in an airplane flying over New Orleans, which is lost to a flood, over 1,000 people are going to die, that's probably one of the worst pictures you could ever have. And that led to people thinking, this guy doesn't care. He rallied the country behind what happened in New York and Washington. Where was he with Katrina? That would be the rap on him. And his popularity begins to go down when that happens.
And a footnote to that picture that you all probably know well of Bush and Air Force One flying over Katrina and seeming very detached. Footnote to that is his powerful political advisor, Karl Rove, that you all probably all recognize the name, had kidney stones during Katrina and was not really in the swing of things. You know, had Karl Rove been able to say, that's a bad idea, please don't do that, would that have had an effect?
And you've read a lot about how a new president is always determined not to make the same mistakes as presidents before them. Notice with both Obama and Trump, that we'll talk about next time, when there's a natural disaster, they at least try to be on top of it. In the back of their mind, I don't want a Katrina, right? I don't want to be viewed as somebody who somehow didn't care, which clearly somebody like Bush with his faith cared for people, but that appearance of neglect, a disaster. Let's take the last 10 minutes and talk about both presidents and their legacies, okay? What they might share in common, how they differ. Any observations on your part? Yes?
Well, when you brought up the photo of Bush, the one that comes to my mind instantly is the mission accomplished.
Which at the time sounded pretty great, right?
Yeah, but now thinking back on it, we're still involved in Iraq, we're still involved in Afghanistan.
Yeah. One of those things that at the time, it looked really super, the president landing in a plane, the banner, but later on, the war goes on. Yes, Sam?
I think nowadays when people hear Clinton, they kind of ignore everything good he may have done, and people's minds immediately go, oh, Monica Lewinsky scandal, or right now,
people's minds usually go to his associations with Jeffrey Epstein, so he doesn't really leave a very good taste in people's mouth nowadays.
Yeah. And his association with the Democratic Leadership Council, trying to move the Democrats to the center, the role of the progressives right now in the Democratic Party, they're seriously questioning Clinton's legacy in many respects. But one other thing about Clinton in terms of impact, think about that behavior and the consequences for 2 presidential elections. Al Gore distancing himself from Bill Clinton when he should have ran on the economy, right? Clinton is popular. He's going to leave off a 68% job approval rating. People might not think that he had personal integrity, but he's popular. They're happy with the economy. Gore distances himself from Clinton, doesn't use Clinton the way that George Herbert Walker Bush had used Ronald Reagan when he won the White House. That scandal plays a role in that. And then think about Hillary Clinton, who, in the context of Donald Trump and the famous recording about grabbing people in a certain place and everything, the Hollywood Access tape, that would normally finish off a presidential candidate, right? But what do the Trump people do? They drag in Bill Clinton's sexual legacy. It damaged both Gore, because he made the decision to distance himself from Clinton, and for Hillary Clinton, had a husband who cheated on her, and a husband whose behavior would come back to haunt her own presidential campaign. Anything else? Yeah.
I think there's 2 aspects that are worth mentioning. Personally, after analyzing everything, I see that both presidents kind of try to push for, a woman being more incorporated in jobs. I mean, you had Condoleezza Rice being the first African-American female Secretary of State. You had Madeleine Albright being the first female Secretary of State. Then you had, Clinton nominating what's her goodness, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to the Supreme Court. And so you kind of see this push for giving minorities a greater voice. Another aspect, I think, is the policy in terms of foreign, kind of expansion of democratic institutions, democratic ideas, especially in Latin America. So that particularly under the Bush administration, under Secretary Rice. And so kind of 2 aspects that I kind of really took from both administrations.
Okay. Nick, you had a question?
I think at the end of Bush's presidency, one thing that's really forgotten is that he started the bailout of the auto industry using the TARP.
Yeah.
And it's often he's never even mentioned in it.
Yeah. And if you want to defend George W. Bush, you would argue that when that crisis takes place, he puts his traditional ideological convictions aside, he listens to his advisors, and he undertakes this very controversial decision to have the TARP program, which is something that Obama had supported also. For Bush's defenders, it helped prevent the Great Recession from becoming another Great Depression and everything. But the consequences politically...
And gives rise to one of the smoother might be the way to put it, but well-honed transition coordinations between opposing parties that we've seen in recent times. The White House transition from Bush to Obama, in part because of the recession, but because George W. was very insistent on making sure that the transition and the handoff was good and smooth. Really did go particularly well. Certainly you can contrast that with, say, the Obama-Trump transition, which was much more fraught.
That decision on the banks, completely detested by the American public. People were hurting. A lot of people lost a good part of their life savings. Millions of people lost their homes. The idea that the banks got bailed out, and then you have Obama, we'll talk about next time, inheriting that horrible economic circumstance. He continues TARP. He has his own economic stimulus plan. The reaction against that in the Tea Party about deficits, about government and everything, in a sense, continues political polarization, makes things much more difficult for Obama. And we have that lasting animosity to this day about banks, big business, trade deals. You think of the last presidential campaign, how all the leading candidates went after various trade deals, including the Pacific trade deal and everything. So the rise of populism, Anything else about their legacies, though, that someone might want to point out? Yes.
I just thought that it was really interesting that we talked so much about how both candidates were fairly moderate and kind of wanted to change their parties and really be more bipartisan and really work with the opposite side. You see that with Clinton coming in and really working with like the budget and raising taxes, but also cutting spending, which is something that you see you would see both parties kind of going, like you see both parties doing the opposite. And then also with Bush coming in and having No Child Left Behind, which we all kind of think of as bad now, but at the time had great bipartisan support. And even kind of looking forward to Obama working with Boehner and how Boehner kind of was pushing to try to work together in the House when you kind of started to see this Republican backlash and really kind of fast forwarding us into the 26th election and just like the Trump agenda and partisanship that we're seeing now, which is something that I kind of hit on last class a little bit, just about how I think politics has really changed, or at least it's perceived that it's changed a lot, and that they don't really care about, I mean personally, I feel at this point in time that they care more about appealing to the far right or far left side of their bases as opposed to really working together for the American people. And I'm sure other people in the class agree with me that we're kind of fed up with it, and we hope for a change, especially with the 2020 election coming up, and just kind of hoping that on both sides, whether it's the left or the right, we see a move back to working together and being less partisan.
For your generation, different from a boomer like me, I grew up with relatives in the 50s and 60s who were experiencing the afterglow of victory in World War II, economic recovery, country moving forward after the Depression. For your whole life, the wars in the Middle East, partisanship, the division. One little tiny thing, though. We always focus on American politics. There is one aspect of the Bush legacy that's sometimes overlooked. He supported very large economic packages to address AIDS in Africa, malaria in Africa, clean water in Africa, that saved millions of lives. So part of the Bush legacy is, for people in the Middle East, over 1 million lives lost there, all the people we've lost, the economic recession, things like that. But there is that other aspect, that other thing. Anything else before we wrap up? Thank you, Emily, for reminding me that I grew up under much more happy circumstances than your generation. I think we need to head out, okay? And we thank C-SPAN for being here. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.